You walk into a university campus today and you expect certain things: lecture halls, dormitories, a library stacked floor to ceiling with books nobody has time to read. You assume this idea is Western. Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna. You assume higher education, as a structured residential international system, was invented in medieval Europe. But the real answer is far stranger. 700 years before Oxford held its first class, a university already existed on the other side of the world. It had dormitories. It had a library with volumes so numerous that when it finally burned, the smoke reportedly hung in the air for months. It had international students. It had entrance exams so difficult that most applicants failed at the gate. Its name was Nalanda. You have probably never walked its halls in your imagination the way you have walked Hogwarts or Oxford's quads. But you should, because what happened there reshapes what you think you know about who invented the university. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are what break people's assumptions first. At its peak, in the 7th century, Nalanda hosted somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 students. Nearly 2,000 teachers lived and taught on campus. This was not a monastery with a few monks reciting scripture. This was a fully residential, multidisciplinary institution. Students studied logic, they studied medicine, they studied astronomy, grammar, and something the modern West likes to think it invented much later: rigorous, structured debate as a method of arriving at truth. Here is where your brain probably resists a little. Wasn't ancient India just temples and mysticism? That assumption itself is worth pausing on, because it says more about how history gets told than about what actually happened. Nalanda was founded in the 5th century CE during the Gupta period, a time you may vaguely associate with ancient India without much more detail. But the Gupta period is sometimes called India's classical age for a reason. It produced the concept of zero as a number. It produced advances in surgery, in metallurgy, in astronomy that predated similar European discoveries by centuries. Nalanda was not an accident. It was the product of a civilization that had already decided knowledge itself deserved a permanent, dedicated home. Picture the campus, because it helps to see it, not just hear about it. Multiple-story brick buildings, some of them monasteries where teachers and students lived together, some of them lecture halls, some of them meditation cells, courtyards, water tanks, stupas rising above the tree line. It stretched across a huge footprint, larger than most Roman forums, larger than most European monastery universities that would appear nearly a millennium later. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 20th century and expanded more recently uncovered only a fraction of the original site. Historians estimate that what has been dug up is still a small percentage of what once stood there. Now here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. To get into Nalanda, you had to pass an oral examination administered by a senior scholar at the gate. Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled to India in the 7th century and studied at Nalanda himself, recorded that most applicants who arrived at the gates were turned away. Only a small fraction, by some accounts 1 or 2 out of every 10, passed the entrance interrogation. This was not a school you paid your way into. This was a school you had to prove yourself worthy of, through knowledge alone. Xuanzang's own writings are one of the reasons historians know as much as they do about Nalanda. He was not the only foreign scholar who made the journey. Students and monks traveled from Korea, from Japan, from Tibet, from Central Asia, from what is now Indonesia and Sri Lanka, crossing deserts and mountain passes for months, sometimes years, to reach this one university in what is now the Indian state of Bihar. Think about the logistics of that. No printing press, no global communication network, and yet word of a place of extraordinary learning had traveled thousands of miles by word of mouth and manuscript, pulling scholars across half a continent. What were they actually learning? This is where Nalanda stops sounding like a monastery and starts sounding like a research university. Buddhist philosophy was central, yes, since Nalanda was founded as a center for Mahayana Buddhist thought, but the curriculum extended far beyond religious study. Sanskrit grammar was taught with an intensity that produced some of history's most sophisticated linguistic theory, centuries before Western linguistics existed as a discipline. Ayurvedic medicine was studied and refined. Mathematics and astronomy were core subjects, building on the same intellectual tradition that had already given the world the decimal place value system. Teaching itself happened through debate. Students didn't simply absorb lectures passively. They were expected to defend positions publicly against challengers, refining their arguments in real time. Historian Dr. Sukumar Dutt, who wrote extensively on Buddhist monastic education in India, described Nalanda's method as producing scholars who could reason under pressure, not just recite from memory. This is strikingly close to what you'd now call the Socratic method, except it was happening in Bihar centuries before Socrates' method would even be systematized into Western pedagogical tradition through his students. Now for the twist, the one that reframes the whole story. If Nalanda was this advanced, this influential, this deeply woven into the world's exchange of ideas, why have so few people heard of it? The answer isn't a gentle one. In 1193 CE, Nalanda was attacked and largely destroyed during a military campaign led by Bakhtiar Khalji. Historical accounts, including later Persian chronicles, describe the university's enormous library, the Dharmaganja, or Treasury of Truth, being set ablaze. According to some traditional accounts, repeated by multiple historians, though difficult to verify with total precision, the fire burned for months, an entire accumulated wealth of manuscripts, some of the only surviving copies of certain philosophical and scientific texts in existence, gone. You should sit with that for a second, not because it needs sensationalizing, but because of what it actually meant. Some of those texts existed nowhere else, not in Constantinople, not in Alexandria's remnants, not in any monastery in Europe. When Nalanda's library burned, portions of human knowledge simply ceased to exist. Historians studying the loss of ancient libraries often place Nalanda's destruction alongside the burning of the Library of Alexandria as one of the great quiet tragedies of intellectual history. Quiet because it doesn't get told nearly as often. Why does Alexandria get films, documentaries, an entire mythology, while Nalanda barely gets a paragraph in most world history textbooks? Part of the answer is about which stories get inherited by whoever ends up writing the dominant version of world history. European colonial-era historians, cataloging India's past through their own frameworks, often treated Indian intellectual history as a footnote to religious history. Buddhism and Hinduism filed away as Eastern spirituality, rather than as civilizations that had produced functioning research universities. It's a framing problem, not a knowledge problem. The knowledge was always there. The framing buried it. Modern archaeology has been slowly correcting this. Excavations at the Nalanda site, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage location, continue to reveal more of the original campus. In 2014, a new international university named Nalanda University was established near the original site, an attempt, symbolic as much as practical, to revive a tradition that had lain dormant for 8 centuries. Scholars, historians, and archaeologists involved in the site's ongoing study, including work published through India's Archaeological Survey, continue to piece together exactly how advanced the original institution actually was. Here's the modern mirror, the part that should sit with you after this video ends. Every time you walk onto a university campus, every time you take an entrance exam, every time you sit in a dormitory arguing philosophy with a roommate at 2 in the morning, you are participating in a tradition that is far older, far more global, and far less exclusively Western than you were taught. The instinct to gather knowledge in one place, to make people prove themselves worthy of learning it, to let students debate their way toward truth rather than simply memorize it, that instinct didn't start in Oxford's stone hallways. It started, at least in one of its earliest and grandest forms, in a sprawling brick campus in Bihar, where thousands of students from a dozen countries once crossed mountains just to be allowed through the gate. You assumed the university was invented in medieval Europe, but the real answer was far stranger and far older than that.